Today we're going to learn about something called CSS Grids, which is a new way for us to create layouts inside websites. Now in this video we're going to talk about what exactly a CSS Grid is and how it compares to the typical way we do layouts inside websites when we program them. And we're going to go ahead and talk about how to actually set up a CSS Grid and how to use it inside a real website. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys what exactly we need to have inside our website before we can actually start using a CSS Grid. So as you guys can see in front of me here, I have a very basic index.html file. I have a style sheet on the right side here, which I linked to inside my index file. And one more thing I added inside my HTML document is a meta tag, which we need in order to actually see responsive websites properly inside our devices. Now, when we talk about CSS Grids, we're basically talking about a way to design layouts, which is going to fix a lot of the problems we had using the traditional way we do layouts today. And what I'm talking about when I say problems that we have with the current way we do layouts, I talk about the fact that right now, if we were to put some elements inside my body tag down here and actually see them inside the browser, if I want some of the elements inside my body tag to appear next to each other, or if I want to do some kind of fancy layout once I get down into cell phone format, then today we're actually kind of limited to the way we can actually set up layouts inside different formats, at least when it comes to the typical way we can actually do layouts using floats and just sort of positioning stuff using CSS. So in order to fix that, CSS Grids were invented in order to allow for us as a developer to, using CSS only, decide where we want our elements to be inside the browser when we view the website, only using CSS. Now today, if I were to actually set up a couple of sections inside my front page here, I would typically insert a header, I would insert a section, maybe a sidebar, and then a footer. Now, if I want my sidebar and my content to be next to each other, then I could do so inside my CSS file using float. So I could actually take my sidebar and put a float left, and then take my content and set a float right. And that way inside the browser, we could actually place these elements next to each other. But doing it this way using float actually limits us when it comes to how we can actually insert the different layouts inside different formats. Because if I were to size my browser down to a cell phone format, if I want my footer, which has information in it, to appear next to the header, we can't do that because it would actually take our elements out from our page and shift around the content inside the HTML document in a way that we can't do using CSS. The only way we can get content next to each other is by actually inserting elements inside the HTML file underneath each other. And this is one of the things that CSS Grids actually fixes for us, because what we can do using CSS is that we can actually go ahead and create a grid inside our page and start inserting elements from our HTML file into the different grid elements using CSS. Meaning that if I have a footer inside my HTML file, I can actually go ahead and put it anywhere inside the grid that I want to, and it doesn't matter in which order my elements inside the HTML file are inside the document. Now, another thing I want to talk about is when it comes to responsiveness, because I mentioned it a few times, which is because today, when it comes to mobile responsiveness or tablet or desktop, it is a must and a requirement that you have to create websites that can be viewed on a cell phone device or tablet. You can't today in 2017 or after 2017 make websites that are not responsive, because most people will use their cell phone or tablets in order to view websites. So we need to have something to make our websites responsive easily inside different devices. Now, some of you are going to ask me, well, we have Bootstrap. Well, even though we have Bootstrap, there are still some benefits from using a CSS grid, which you can't do using Bootstrap. And I realize we have something called FlexGrid inside Bootstrap, but it's not the same as CSS Grids. There are some benefits to using CSS Grids instead, and I will leave a link in the description where you guys can learn more about the differences between Bootstrap and CSS Grids. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you guys how to actually set up a grid inside your website. And the code that you guys see on the screen here is basically all we need in order to get started with CSS Grids. Now, do bear in mind, inside my styles here, I just inserted a overall styling where I set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0 in order to get everything reset inside the browser so we don't get any kind of weird spacing. Okay, so that's the only purpose for the code inside my style sheet here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do something I haven't really done on my channel before, which is I'm going to visualize what I'm talking about using animations. because I know that CSS grids is something that's quite new to a lot of people, and most people watching this video are going to be people who are used to doing layouts in the way that we used to, which is using float. So in order to teach CSS grids in a way that's really easy to understand, I'm going to use animations in this video, okay? So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to show you guys how we're going to set up the elements inside the body tag here, and then afterwards I'm going to animate so you guys can actually see what I talk about. So inside the body tag, what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to create a container. And this container here is going to be the grid that we use inside our website. So all the content inside the website, such as the header, the content, the sidebar, the footer, are going to be placed inside this container here. So I'm going to create a div, which I'm going to give a class set to grid, just to give it something that makes sense. Now inside this grid class, I'm going to insert a couple of divs. So I'm going to insert a number in between these div tags. I'm just going to say 1. Then I'm going to copy it and just paste it underneath a couple of times so we have something to play with inside our browser. I'm going to change the numbers to 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then afterwards, I'm going to go inside my style sheet and just give these a background color so you can actually see what is going on inside the browser. So I'm going to say we have a class called grid, and inside the grid, we have a div box. And then every other div box, I'm going to give a different color so you can actually see them. So I'm going to say we have after div, nth dash child, parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, I'm going to write even. Just going to move it over so you guys can actually see it. And then we're going to say curly brackets. And then inside of here, we're going to say background color set to red. Then I'm going to copy this, paste it below here, and say we have odd div boxes inside this grid class over here. We're also going to go ahead and change the color so we have green instead of red. And then if I go inside my browser, you guys can see that now we can actually see what we have inside the website. So what we just did is we created 5 elements inside our HTML file. And right now, these would actually be the same as different sections inside your website. So the top one up here called number 1 could actually be the title. We could have number 2, which could be the header. Then number 3 could be the sidebar. Number 4 could be the content. And then number 5 could be the footer. Just as an example. If I were to go back inside my code, what we can actually do here is we can actually insert these different div elements inside a grid. And we haven't actually defined that this is going to be a grid yet. So going inside our style sheet here, I'm going to go ahead and say that we want to style class grid, curly brackets. And then inside the curly brackets, I'm going to say that we want to display this as a grid. And this is basically all we had to do in order to define a CSS grid inside the HTML file. Now we also need to actually place these elements inside the grid in a way that we can actually harness the power of CSS grids, and right now we're basically just displaying these, underneath each other. If we were to actually save all of this and go back and refresh, you guys can see that it doesn't really change anything. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going inside my document, and after displaying grid inside the grid, I can actually start defining columns and rows inside the grid. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to next line. I'm going to say we have something called a grid dash template dash columns colon semicolon. Now inside these columns, we need to define how many columns we want inside this grid. Now right now we don't actually have any kind of columns, so we need to define at least one column inside the columns here. So I'm going to say we have something called one fraction, which is actually a new measurement we have inside CSS3, which is going to say that the entire width of this grid box is going to be one fraction. So this is going to give me one column inside the grid. Now if I were to say that we want to have 2 columns inside this grid here, I can go ahead and add in another fraction. So we can actually say space, one fraction, and now we have 2 columns inside the grid. So when it comes to columns and rows, right now as you guys can see in the illustration, we have one column, we have a second column, and in order to define where we want content to go, we need to refer to the lines outside the columns. So right now we have line 1, we have line 2, and line 3, which right now define that we have 2 columns inside this grid. So now that we have 2 columns inside our grid here, we can actually go ahead and go inside the browser and test this one out. So if I were to open up my browser and refresh, you guys can see that right now we have 2 columns inside our grid. and the content inside the grid automatically knows where it needs to be inside the grid. So right now we have the first item, which is div 1, which is going to be the first one inside the grid. Then we have div 2, and as you guys can see, it goes next to each other without us actually using float inside the CSS file. Then we have the third item, which goes down to the next line. Then we have the fourth item, and so on and so on and so on. So as you guys can see, it actually behaves like we used float inside the different elements. So what we can do now is we can actually go back inside our code, and inside the code we can actually go ahead and test out some different measurements we have inside the columns here. So right now we use one fraction. We could also go ahead and change this. So if I want my first column to only be 200 pixels, I can go ahead and save it, go inside my browser, refresh, and now you guys can see that the first column is only 200 pixels. We can also go ahead and use percentage if we want to. We can go ahead and say 20%. Save it, go inside and refresh, and as you guys can see, we get a new width inside the column. Now we also have a value called auto inside the measurements here, so we can actually go ahead and say we want the first one to be auto. Then if I go back inside the website, you guys can see it actually shrinks down and fits the content that we have inside the column. So right now, as you guys can see, we only have 1, 3, and 5, which is not very long when it comes to the width. So it's going to shrink down and fit the content. And then the second column is just going to fit whatever space is left inside the browser, which is a really nice feature inside CSS grids. Now, when it comes to the divs we have inside the grid, we call these grid items. And with the grid items, you can actually decide how much space they should take up inside our grid. So as you guys can see, I did actually make some changes to the divs down here. I gave them a class called title, header, sidebar, content, and footer. And I also inserted those names inside divs here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside my style sheet. I'm going to go underneath my grid in here. And I'm going to say I want to style my title. And with the title, I would like for it to span from the first column to the second column, meaning that it's going to take up the entire row inside the grid here. Now there's a couple of ways we can do that. The first way is we can go ahead and say grid dash column dash start colon semicolon, and then inside of here we can actually go ahead and say that we want the title to start at line 1 inside column 1, and then underneath here we can go ahead and say we want grid dash column dash end colon semicolon, and then we want it to end at line 3, which right now, since we have 2 columns, is going to be the last line inside the columns. So if I were to go ahead and save this and go inside and refresh my browser, you guys can see that right now the title goes all the way from left to right. And you can also see that all the content inside our website shifted around to make space for the title inside the top of the website. A faster way we could actually write this is if I were to go ahead and delete what we did here. And then instead, I can go ahead and say grid column and say that we want to start at line 1 / line 3, which means that right now we start at 1 and go to line 3. If I go ahead and save this, go inside my browser, refresh, you guys can see it does the exact same thing. Now, when it comes to the values inside the grid column or the grid rows, we can also go ahead and use something called span. So if we were to go back to what we had before, I can actually go ahead and just delete the start and say we want to end the column by making the end span 2 lines inside the grid. So I can actually say span 2, save it, refresh the browser, and as you guys can see, we again get the same thing. If I were to change this to a 1, then you guys can see it only spans 1 inside the grid here, which means that it starts at line 1, which is on the left side. Then it goes to the second line, which right now is inside the middle. And then the third line is on the right side. Okay. So now we talked a bit about how to make our content appear in one line inside the website. And the next thing I want to mention here is that we can also do the same thing when it comes to rows. So just like we had a grid column end and a grid column start and a grid column, we can do the exact same thing when it comes to rows. So if we were to go down to the next line, I can say grid dash row dash end colon semicolon, and then I can tell it to span 2. So if we were to go back inside the website, you guys can see that now the title should appear in the second line down here as well. So if we refresh, you guys can see now it takes up more space. So now we just talked about a bunch of different ways we could actually place the content inside the grid, but it can be kind of tough to remember all the different numbers and the columns and the rows. So there's a much easier way for us to do this without having to worry about columns or rows. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here is I'm going to go ahead and delete everything we have inside the title class. And instead, I'm going to give it a grid area, which I'm going to set to title. So right now I just named the title class title. So I'm going to copy this because we want to have one for each of the sections inside our grid. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it down 4 more times. And then I'm going to go ahead and change the name. So we have the second one up here, which is going to be named header inside both the grid area and inside the class name. So we're going to go ahead and say header both places. Now I'm going to go ahead and change the third one to sidebar. The fourth one is going to be content. Then the last one down here is going to be the footer. So now that we have all these sections with names, we can actually go ahead and go up inside our grid, and we're going to go ahead and define not just the columns, but also the rows inside this grid. So I'm going to go down to the next line. I'm going to say grid dash template rows colon semicolon. And then I'm going to go ahead and set this one to 1 frame because I want the title to be in 1 line. Then I'm going to set 1 frame for the header. Then I'm going to set 1 frame for the content and the sidebar. And then I'm going to go ahead and set 1 frame for the footer. So now that we have these defined, we can actually go to the next line and say we want to set a grid template areas like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and go down to the next line right before we end off the semicolon. I'm going to say double quotes. And then this right here is going to be the first row inside our grid. So right now the first row up here, which is 1 frame, is going to be everything put inside these double quotes. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here is I'm going to say, well, we have 2 columns inside this grid here. So I need to insert 2 items inside the double quotes. Now right now, because I want the title to go from left to right all the way across, I'm going to copy the grid area name down here called title, paste it in, say space, and paste it in. Now if you only had 1 column up here, I just need to have it once inside my areas down here, but because we have 2 columns, we need to insert it twice. So I'm going to go ahead and go down to the next line before the semicolon, say double quotes, because we have 4 rows inside our design here. So we need to make sure we do this 4 times. Okay. So on the second row, I'm going to insert the header, just like we did with the title. I'm going to go ahead and say we have another row. And then I'm going to insert the sidebar as the first item. And then I'm going to go ahead and insert the content as the second item. So right now the sidebar and the content are going to be next to each other inside our layout. I'm going to go to the next line and then write footer, space, footer. So now if we were to go back inside the website and refresh, whoops, I did actually make a typo here. We need to make sure we have all the different classes here named. So we need to say footer. And now if we go back and refresh, you guys can see that the title goes from left to right. The header goes from left to right. The sidebar and the content are going to be next to each other. And then the footer is going to be at the bottom here. So what this allows for us to do essentially is that we can go back up inside our areas. And if I want to have the footer at the top here instead of at the bottom here, I can go ahead and copy it. And then instead of the title, I can paste it in and just switch them around like so. So now the footer would actually appear in the top instead. When I refresh, you guys can see that now we have the footer at the very top. And the reason that this is so incredibly cool when it comes to CSS grids is because that right now inside our template, inside our HTML file, the footer should not be allowed to be put at the top of our layout. But because we use CSS grids, it allows for us to do this and shift around the content in a way that wouldn't be possible using the traditional way we do layouts inside our code. So what we can also do here, just to mess around with this for a little bit, to show you guys a couple of examples here, if I were to go back and put the title at the top instead, is that we can also go ahead and say, well, let's actually have the sidebar go all the way down to the bottom as well. So now the sidebar is going to be on 2 rows, and then the content and the footer is going to be on the right side of it. So we go back inside and refresh. You guys can see we can also do that as well. So what about white space? Well, what CSS grids allows for us to do when it comes to white spaces is that we can actually go ahead and say, well, what if I want the header to just appear on the left side of my columns? I can actually go and delete the right header and instead write punctuation. So right now, punctuation, what that means is that it's going to not fill out the space over here. So it's going to leave a white space, which is also something that is really cool when it comes to these grids here. Now let's go ahead and talk about wrappers inside a CSS grid, because right now, as you guys may have noticed, the website goes all the way from the left side to the right side. And in most websites, we have a wrapper. So if I were to go back inside my design here and just go back to our normal layout, which is the title, header, sidebar, and the footer. So let's actually go ahead and copy that over as well. If you go back up inside our columns, the way we can create a wrapper is if we were to, instead of saying that we have 2 columns, we can go ahead and insert 2 more columns inside the middle here. So I can go ahead and say that the middle columns should have a width as 500 pixels, like so. And what we can then do down here inside our areas, because we need to change this according to what we have up here. So we need to make sure we have 4 columns inside this areas down here. So I'm going to say we have a punctuation space, which was a white space. Going to copy it down to all the columns. Then I'm going to go afterwards and make sure we have the same thing on the right side. And then I'm going to go ahead and save it and refresh the browser. So now you guys can see we have white space on the sides. And if we were to refresh the browser and just slide it from left to right, you guys can see that the wrapper actually works. Now the next thing I want to show you guys is how we can actually customize the grid items inside our grid. So if we were to go inside the browser, you guys can see that if we were to take one of the grids, for example, the content, the background color goes all the way from the left side to the right side. So the grid takes up the entire space that we allow for it to have inside the browser. Now, if I want to customize the position of the grid item I have inside the grid, we can actually go ahead and go back inside our code and say, let's go ahead and take the content and write a piece of code called justify-self. semicolon, and tell it that we want to justify it to the left side of the grid. So right now we can say start, save it, go inside our browser, refresh, and now you guys can see that the content or the entire grid is actually positioning itself to the left side of the grid, just taking up the space that the content takes up inside the grid. We can go ahead and do the same thing to the right side, so I can actually go ahead and say end. You can refresh the browser, and now you guys can see it goes to the right side. We can also center it by writing center. Now, when it comes to doing the same thing but up and down instead, we can go ahead and use something called not justify but align. And then the commands are the same thing as we did with justify. You can use start, end, and center. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is something called nested items. So right now, as you guys can see, we have the main grid over here with grid items inside of it. And if we were to insert content inside one of these grid items, like the content box down here, if we were to go down to the next line and create a paragraph that has maybe A inside of it, then do the same thing underneath here, create a second paragraph that has B. These would actually be what we call nested items. Now, when it comes to nested items, they're not actually part of the main grid we have up here, which means that if we were to actually just go ahead and delete the line self we created over here because we don't actually need it, and then save the files, go inside the browser, refresh, you guys can see that right now, the paragraphs will actually appear inside the content grid item. Now, what you guys will also notice is that all the heights changed, and that's because the content inside one of the boxes created another height for the content box, and because all the boxes has one fraction for the row measurements, they're all gonna go ahead and change accordingly. So right now you guys can see the nested items in here are actually not part of the main grid. Now what we can do is we can actually go ahead and create a second grid inside this grid here. So if we were to go back inside my code, I can actually make content to, if we say display grid, is we can actually go ahead and make it into a second grid. And then the content inside the content grid item actually becomes grid items of content. So we don't have to stick with just one grid inside our designs or our layouts. We can actually go ahead and use them over and over and over again, which is a really nice feature when it comes to CSS grids. So just went ahead and deleted everything again. So right now we just have content inside the content grid item, and inside the content class over here, we don't have the display grid. So the last thing I want to talk about is mobile responsiveness, because using CSS grids becomes incredibly easy when it comes to mobile responsiveness. So if I were to go ahead and go down to the bottom of my style sheet and say we have a media query, so we're going to say at media space screen and parentheses, curly brackets, and then inside the parentheses we can go and say min dash width colon and set it to 736 pixels. So right now when we see the website inside anything larger than 736 pixels in width, it's going to start adding the styling inside the media query, which is basic HTML and CSS. So what I can do is I can go up inside my style sheet and copy the grid that we have up at the top here, and paste it inside the media query. Now, what you guys may have noticed is that when I did this, I focused on making the desktop version the one that appears inside the media query. So right now we don't need to make any changes to our grid because I think this should be the desktop version. But if we were to go back up to the top grid, I can actually go ahead and make a mobile version. So right now I can actually go ahead and say we don't want white space on the side here. So we're just going to go ahead and delete those. And I can actually go ahead and delete the 500 pixels inside our columns here. So we just have 2 columns. I'm also going to go ahead and put the content on a separate line for itself. So I'm just going to go down to the next line and paste it in twice and create a sidebar up here instead of the content and the sidebar next to each other. So what we can do now is we can go ahead and go inside the browser, refresh, and once I go down to cell phone format, you guys can see that everything switches inside the cell phone view. One more thing I forgot to mention is that we can also create something called a gap. So I can say grid-gap and set this one to 10 pixels. Meaning that right now if we were to go inside the browser, refresh, you guys can see we get a gap in between all the different grids. This also happens inside the desktop format. So it becomes really easy for us to change the layout once we go to cell phone or to tablet or to desktop just by using media queries inside our Starseed, which is something that's really easy to do. And it allows for us to move around the content in a way that we couldn't do before, which in my mind is one of the best things about CSS grids. Now, I know there's going to be people asking me about browser support because this is one thing we need to address, because I know a lot of people are going to be turned off by the fact that some browsers still don't support CSS grids. At least as I'm making this video, some browsers don't do it. Now, when it comes to Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge, they don't right now, as I'm making this video, currently support CSS grids. Now, Microsoft Edge will support it in a couple of weeks from now, or at least I heard so, but I'm not sure when it comes to Internet Explorer, and I'm not even sure if it's going to support this in the future. So some of you guys are going to be asking me, well, should we even use CSS grids when not all browsers support it, at least right now? Now, when it comes to viewing the website inside a non-supported browser, what you will actually see is the cell phone format of the actual website. And a lot of experts are actually going to tell you that once you do actually design and program websites, that you should always focus on making it mobile first and then afterward focus on desktop. So right now inside the Starseed, what you guys can see is that I did actually go ahead and support mobile first, and then afterwards I focused on making it into a desktop format. And the reason for this is that if you were to view a desktop version inside a mobile phone, then it's a lot worse than if you were to view a cell phone format inside a desktop. And with that argument, a lot of people will also tell you that mobile versions of websites do actually look better inside desktop browsers, even though there's a desktop version available. And the only way we can get all browsers to actually support this is if we do actually use CSS grids, because it's still a new thing. Some people might be hesitant when it comes to using CSS grids, but the only way we can get browsers to actually support this is if we start using it inside our web designs, because then the people behind the browsers are forced to implement CSS grids inside their browsers. So this is basically all I want to show you guys when it comes to CSS grids. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time.